All right. I have 12 minutes and then we'll start over again.
Okay.
So, first question that Dad had.
Whoops.
Dad was wondering, what were family gatherings like in like church? Did you talk, or were people speaking in German or?
When I was real little, we had German services, and then gradually they changed them to every other Sunday they would be German. But I was confirmed in English, and I think pretty much we had English services. So,
What year was your confirmation?
1941,
Okay.
I think.
And then were you born in Lake City?
I was born
or?
in Red Wing.
In Red Wing, okay.
And they had to get me partway home by sleigh. They could get out into the Hay Creek area by car, but from there on we went by sled
Very nice.
because it was in November, or actually the first part of December by the time I went home.
So how long were you in Red Wing then before coming home? Do you know? Or?
No, I don't remember.
Okay. And it was in a hospital then?
Yeah.
Very nice.
So
When thinking of church services and what I've read a little bit, was it still kind of like a little bit of segregation where women sat on one side
yes.
and men were on the other?
the women sat on the right-hand side, the men sat on the left-hand side.
When did that change?
Not until, I would say, in the 40s probably.
Oh, wow, so right after your confirmation.
Well, later than that, I think.
Okay.
But then the children, they all pretty much sat down in the front together,
Okay.
and except for the real little ones. But once we were in Sunday school and so on, then we all kind of sat down in the front. So,
All right.
and we had the Christmas services, and we had a real Christmas tree, a big Christmas tree with actual candles on it.
Oh, wow. When did that change over from being candles to?
Probably, I would say in the 1940s, I would think. Maybe 30. Let's see, I was born in 1927. Probably about 1940.
So the 40s were a big time for change in the church.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think so. I may be wrong on that, but I don't remember for sure. But I know it was a long time that we had the candles on the Christmas tree.
Okay.
I imagine they were just lit while we were having our program, though.
Oh, okay.
So.
Did your family have horses up until a certain point and then switch to a car, or did you have horses up for a really long time?
We had a car by the time I was born.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you still had some horses around
Oh, yes.
so obviously they have the sleigh and stuff.
They did the farming with the horses.
Okay.
And we would take a horse and sleigh to church
Well, that must have been fun.
in the winter. It was fun, it was cold. But they had a barn by the church where people could put their horses in.
Okay.
And we'd have, the church was your social life. So you always, whatever parties you had, was with people from church. And we'd go sometimes a couple miles by horse and buggy, or horse and sleigh in the wintertime. Everybody put their horses in the barn one way or another, and the parents would play cards and the kids would fall asleep on the beds.
Well, since there was a lot of things going on in the 40s, did you feel effects of like any of the wars that had been going on?
Yes, because, oh yes, there was rationing for sugar products and tires and gas and nylons and all those things. And of course my brother was in the service, so my brother Alan.
Was he Army or
He was in
Navy?
the Army.
Okay.
And he was in one of the islands is where he was finally stationed. Can't think of it.
We can look it up later too.
Yeah.
What was the hardest part for I guess for the rationing, maybe.
Well, I suppose the gas, you got so many coupons, and when they were gone, they were gone.
At least you had the horses.
Right.
At least there was that, right?
Right. And sugar, of course, we learned to bake with honey a lot. We made honey cakes and used honey in place of a lot of things.
Is there some recipes that you'd like to try again now using the honey still, or?
I might have a couple of recipes that have honey, but otherwise I don't know that I have a lot of that anymore.
Okay.
But when the stores would get certain things in, everybody would rush to the store to get some of the stuff.
And the stores, I guess, would probably ration then too, like how many people,
Yeah.
to make sure everybody got some if they all waited
And
for
we
it.
favorite customers, of course, got the stuff.
Were you guys favorite customers some
Yeah.
places? Well, so you got a few extra things then.
See, and that actually went on until when I was working in Red Wing right after high school. Because I can remember we'd go down to this one store and get marshmallows and things like that.
Okay.
So,
Well, speaking of working, what was your first job?
my first job, well, actually my first job when I was in high school was as a waitress at the Silver Sail Cafe.
Okay.
I'd go down and work on nights when they had meetings there, or on nights when there was a ball game or something at school, because people had a habit of coming down after the games.
Mm-hmm.
And our specialty was root beer bullets.
Really good root beer flush then?
Really good root beer bullets. You didn't put the ice cream in the glass purse first. You put the root beer in first, and then you put the ice cream on, because that's the float.
That makes more sense in the way I do it.
So that was my very first job, but then after I graduated, I worked in a dress shop in Red Wing. Not very long, because I had to have an appendicitis operation. And then the lady decided maybe she didn't need me. But in the meantime, the Suskovic jewelry store was right next door. And my parents couldn't get my watch that they were going to give me for graduation. And then he called and said that he had a watch. That was another thing that was hard to get, anything with gold on. And so he called and said he had a watch for me. And then he said to me, Mr. Bentley, the attorney next door, is looking for a secretary. And he said, why don't you go up and see if he'd be interested in hiring you? And he did, because his partner had left for Nuremberg, Germany to be on the trials over there.
Okay.
And so he was alone and he needed a secretary. So that was really my
Your first real job?
first real job.
All right. Did you have any other jobs after that, or?
Farming. Because then we got married in 1948. And so then you just didn't think it. Well, I did go back and help him during tax time for a year. And then after that it was just keeping house and farming.
So what was your wedding like?
Not very big. I think there were 80 guests, and that was just some Schwartaus. A few Aylan, the Dicke families, and a few of the there were a few Garishes there, because Gail Garish, my cousin, was my flower girl.
Okay.
And Florence was my bridesmaid. Vernon, my brother, was the best man. That was all of it.
All right.
And so that went on then, farming, until Bob got sick. And that's when life really started getting interesting, because the boys had to stay home and do chores and Ron was excused from first hour class so he could stay home and do some chores. Because they said, here taking typing, you don't have to worry about that. You're good enough at typing. So just stay home and do chores for that first hour. So that was, we kept on farming then for a year after he died in 1949. And then I came home I went out and took census that year in 1950.
Okay.
And when I came home, Bruce said, Mom, some insurance company called for you. And I said, yeah, they want to sell me insurance. So I didn't reply to their call. Then the second time they called, I think it was the third time that they finally called and said, we just want to talk to your mother. And they wanted to hire me as a secretary in the insurance office. They had heard about me through Randy Bentley, my attorney. So that was one of the best things that could have happened, because it gave me something to do and
Keep your mind
kept
occupied.
my mind off other things.
One second, I need to. Okay, we're good to keep going. What would you say was the best times of your life?
Best times of my life.
Yes.
Well, they were the first 21 years in my marriage, I think. They were good times. But then I had 8 years when I was alone, and then I remarried, which, I'll be very honest, a second marriage is entirely different.
What was different between? I mean, other than some of the obvious things, what was different between the first wedding and the second wedding?
The second wedding was very simple. We went up to the church. Our families were there. Just our children, not even our parents were there. There was no music, nothing. We just went and got married.
And so great grandma and grandpa were still
Yeah,
around at the time, or?
yeah. Yeah, but we just didn't invite anyone but our children. So, very simple. We went to the covered bridge and had dinner that evening, and that was it.
So what were Dad, Uncle Chuck, and Uncle Ron like when they were growing up?
They were good kids. They never gave me a problem. They were helpful. They were just good students and active in 4-H and school, and but they had a hard time too then when their dad was sick. It made it totally changed their lives, because they naturally would have been involved in the farming, and most likely one of them would have taken over the farm as they grew older. But they went on to college, and somehow all ended up in extension.
It's just meant to be.
It was just meant to be. I think they looked up to Mr. Kuno, who was the extension agent for years in Goodyear County, and then Dick Walter. They just had good backgrounds, I think, in the extension field, and that's where they ended up.
And two of them are still in the farm country and a little
Yeah.
bit of farming.
Yeah. But and then when Chuck came, after I remarried, and Chuck came back, was probably the worst time anybody could think about starting farming, because the prices were very bad. Interest rates to get started were very high. And then he's put whatever money he had saved and borrowed into getting started farming. And the wind came and took some of the buildings, and that made life really tough. And then another time, the next year, I think it was, he got hailed out. So it was just not the thing to be doing at that time, and it was a really bad time to be starting farming. There were many people that didn't make it during that time.
Yeah.
So,
What was life like? Like, what was it like growing up before the 1940s was?
well, we walked 2.5 miles to school. A lot of times we would cut through fields, that made it shorter, but going around the, I'm not 2.5, 2.25 miles. If we went around the road. And we did that a lot. In the winter, they would sometimes have to take us with a horse and sleigh. And we had neighbors that they would ride with us for the most part because they didn't have horses. The roads would be really drifted and the horses would even get stuck sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't have a real good sleigh, and they didn't have big enough horses that were going to make it through there. They were
Smaller workhorses
Yeah.
instead of.
so. And school, we had, well, all eight grades went across the road to get the water, but we just made it through everything. We always had Christmas programs.
Mm-hmm.
Quite a production, and I think a lot of times we had a Thanksgiving program too.
So was it a public school or was it more of a church-run school?
No, it was a public school. We had one of the nicer schools around because it even had a nice basement that we could play in the winter and so forth.
Oh, nice.
And we had a library, which most of the schools didn't. So we had a pretty nice school.
And it was a couple rooms then?
No,
Or just one room?
Just one room.
And so library would
one
have been
teacher.
Library would have been in the basement or
No, the library was a separate little room
separate
off to
room.
the front of the big room.
All right.
And then it had a big wood stove. And that's where we would hang our clothes by that then to dry them out. So we could get home again with dry clothes.
Were you still learning German at school then,
No,
or no? That
no.
was just done. That was just done at home, and
Yeah.
so was that an often like? Did you have like times where you'd sit down and you'd go over like German lessons at home or anything, or
No,
was that just at
no,
church?
that
or-
was just at church.
Just at church.
No.
Um, Still on school. Do you remember what any of your school lunches were like?
Sure, we carried them in a syrup pail, gallon syrup pail. And there'd be sandwiches and fruit and some cookie or cake, whatever there was. And occasionally we could take soup and we would heat it then by that stove, big stove that we had in there.
Okay.
So,
Very nice.
I was trying to think how many kids there were in school when I was probably 10 or 12, I would say, in school, in all the grades.
Okay. So you graduated from high school in
1945.
1945. All right, and then from there is just planning on home life, or like what were your plans after high school originally?
Well, I always thought I wanted to be a secretary because I took shorthand and typing, and so that was my goal, to get a secretarial job.
Okay.
So,
So you're almost all set after school then?
yeah, you didn't
Get right into
you
it.
didn't go to college or any tech schools to get it. You just worked your way into it.
Is there anything that you feel it's important for us to like look back and know especially? That's kind of a tough question. But
Yeah, kind of a tough question there. Well, my parents were very good to us. We always had relatives coming every summer. My mother's brothers and sisters would come to visit.
Mhm.
And we had big gardens and did a lot of canning and picking lots of berries. These relatives, sometimes they would come and they would help out in the field then if it was during cutting the grain and shocking the grain. My couple of uncles would go out and help them do that. But for the most part, my mother had to cook for these people.
How many people would come at a time?
Oh, 4 or 5.
Okay.
And then as the kids had kids, and there'd be a couple little kids coming along.
And they'd stay all summer and
No, they'd stay a couple weeks.
just a couple weeks.
Yeah.
Okay.
So at the most, I would say a couple weeks.
What was your favorite part of childhood?
Going over to the neighbors and playing house in their corn crib. And playing house and playing store. That was over at the Peters girls. And we were always together with him. And during our confirmation training was every summer, I think it was from 6th grade on, for 3 years I think we had to go, for 6 weeks in June and July. And one year we would have the teacher from the parochial school in Belvedere, and then the next year we would have the pastor who completed and then they would change off. And that was we had catechism and Bible history and just lots of different, really a lot of training. Learned a lot of hymns and prayers and so forth, which they don't do now.
Yeah. So how did you meet Grandpa Bob?
Well, we actually met at a group called Rural Youth. That was kind of an extension of 4-H in a way. It was people that had been in 4-H and were finished. At that time they went until they were 21, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, they had this Rural Youth group, so it was a county group of young people from all over the county. And we never belonged to 4-H, but apparently we had friends that invited us to come to this Rural Youth group. And so my brother Vernon and I were the only ones that went to that. Although Bob said, see, Mikey's lived next door, and I was out there in Elk Brona when both boys were born.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I saw you when you were working over there, and we were over there scratching. He said, I always thought I was going to meet her sometime. And so we met at this Rural Youth group, and went lots of roller skating.
Yeah.
So that's how we met.
At what point did you know that you were gonna marry him?
After a year. Actually before that, because I think our first date was on July 18th, and then the following year on July 18th we were engaged. So that was.
So you had that feeling, and you just knew.
Yeah. So.
Oh.
No.
Great. Well, I think that is all that